Today we're going to dive deep into a law that truly reshaped the American workplace, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this isn't just some dusty old law. It's a living piece of legislation that's still evolving today. We're going to break down not just what the law says, but how it works, and, just as importantly, where it falls short in the real world.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the policy itself. Then we'll look at the gap between the law on paper and what people actually experience at work. From there, we'll pivot to solutions, looking at concrete recommendations, the advocacy needed to make them happen, and the critical role social workers play in this fight.
All right, first up, let's lay the groundwork. Before we can really dig into the social impact of Title VII, we have to be absolutely clear on what the law is, where it came from, and how it's designed to function.
At its heart, Title VII is pretty straightforward. It makes it illegal for employers to discriminate against someone because of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But here's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Its passage also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which is the federal agency tasked with actually enforcing these protections.
This timeline really shows you just how dynamic this law is. For more than 50 years, its protections were understood in a certain way. But then, in 2020, everything shifted with the landmark Supreme Court case Bostock v. Clayton County. The court decided that discriminating against someone because of sex also includes their sexual orientation and gender identity. This was a monumental expansion of the law's reach.
And this wasn't just some abstract legal debate. It centered on real people, like Gerald Bostock, who was fired from his job simply because his employer found out he played in a gay softball league. The Supreme Court's decision didn't just resolve his case, it closed a huge gap in federal law, showing how a foundational piece of legislation can adapt to meet society's evolving understanding of equality, decades after it was first written.
So how does this law actually get enforced? Well, looking at this process, you can see a key weakness right away. The entire system is reactive. A discriminatory act has to happen first. Then, the burden is on the employee to file a formal complaint. Only then does the EEOC's investigation get started, which might eventually lead to some kind of remedy.
This really gets to the core paradox of Title VII. It's designed like a fire extinguisher, absolutely essential once a fire has started, but it does almost nothing to fireproof the building in the first place. Because it's reactive, it completely depends on individuals reporting incidents. But fear of getting fired or other retaliation leads to massive underreporting. And as the law's protections expand, those already strained federal resources get stretched even thinner, which means long, frustrating delays for people seeking justice.
Okay, so that's the law on paper. But what about in the real world? Let's shift gears and explore the often huge gap between the protections this law promises and the daily lived experiences of employees.
To really get a sense of the scale of this problem, just look at this number. Research suggests about 1/3 of all LGBTQ+ employees have faced some kind of discrimination on the job. And we have to remember, that number only captures what actually gets reported. The real scope of the issue is almost certainly much, much bigger. And a huge reason for that underreporting is this phenomenon called covering. It's the constant, exhausting mental work of hiding parts of who you are just to fit in or avoid bias. Changing how you dress or speak, dodging personal questions about your weekend. Not only does this take a heavy psychological toll, but it completely skews our data, making the true impact of discrimination nearly impossible to measure.
It's also so important to understand that discrimination rarely happens in a vacuum. It's often intersectional. As the source material shows, people who are racial and ethnic minorities, women, immigrants, and LGBTQ+ are all disproportionately affected. And this is especially true in industries with very little oversight or job security, where these biases can really run rampant.
To really analyze this issue on a deeper level, we can use a few key social theories. Think of them as different lenses to view the problem. Minority stress theory helps us understand the chronic background stress that comes from just existing in a world with prejudice. Conflict theory zooms out and focuses on society's power imbalances, how dominant groups maintain control. And finally, human rights theory frames this whole thing as a fundamental question of equality and the basic right to be protected by the law.
Every policy has goals you can see on the surface and goals that are a little more hidden. The manifest or obvious goals of Title VII are clear: get rid of discrimination and give victims a way to seek justice. But there are also latent or underlying goals: to create a single national standard for equality and to push companies to become more accountable for the cultures they create.
Okay, so we've analyzed the problem and the gap between the law's intent and its real-world effect. So now what? How do we fix it? That brings us to our third section, where we shift from looking at the problem to exploring some concrete proactive solutions.
The first big recommendation is all about making a fundamental shift from being reactive to being preventive. And the way you do that is through education. We're not just talking about checking a box with some boring DEI training. This is about building a real culture of understanding, one that not only knows about the Bostock protections, but also recognizes the corrosive, subtle damage caused by things like implicit bias and microaggressions. The whole idea is to stop discrimination before it even has a chance to start.
The second recommendation really hones in on that problem of underreporting, because if people don't feel safe, the system just doesn't work, period. To build that trust, organizations need way better systems. This means things like creating anonymous channels for reporting, having transparent investigation procedures, and, this one is absolutely key, enforcing ironclad anti-retaliation policies so employees aren't afraid to come forward. And, finally, the analysis calls for a major expansion of outreach. Because, let's be honest, a right you don't know you have is a right you can't use. This is especially critical for vulnerable groups like immigrants or low-wage workers, who often face huge language and cultural barriers. The outreach has to meet these communities where they are and make sure they truly understand their rights.
So we have the recommendations, but how do we turn these great ideas into actual, tangible change? Well, the answer is targeted advocacy, which brings us right into our next section.
The strategies for making this happen really operate on 3 different levels, and you'll see they each mirror one of our recommendations. First, there's legislative advocacy, pushing for new laws that actually mandate proactive training. Second, there's organizational advocacy, pressuring companies from the inside to build those safer reporting systems. And third, there's community-based advocacy, partnering with local groups to get education directly to the people who need it most.
And this all leads to our final section. In this complex web of policy, companies, and communities, where do professionals fit in? Here, we're going to focus specifically on the vital role that social workers can play in driving all of these advocacy efforts.
You see, social workers are in this unique position to act as a bridge. They can bring community organizations together, they can serve as a voice for employees who are too afraid to speak up for themselves, and they can connect people directly with legal help. They use their skills not just to help individuals navigate a broken system, but to actually influence policy and help break down the cultural barriers that allow discrimination to keep happening.
And that really brings us to the central challenge we're facing. Title VII provides a crucial legal shield, but it doesn't always stop the harm from happening in the first place. So we're left with this critical question to think about. If a law protects but doesn't prevent, what is the next frontier we need to cross to achieve true workplace equality?